All right, everybody. I'm back for the second part of the lecture on the French Revolution. And where we left off the story last time was with Sieyès. Remember, he was describing what the Third Estate asked for, which he very clearly thought was not even near enough, um, but that it was asking simply to be something, right? And these were the demands, in fact, of the bourgeoisie, of the members of the non noble members of the Third Estate in those months essentially before the Estates General met, that they wanted to make sure that the Third Estate would only be represented by non nobles, that there would be more members of the delegation of the Third Estate than the aristocracy and the nobility, and that the orders would not actually vote by order, but that they would vote essentially by head. So that even though, in fact, um, it was a meeting of estates, it would start to look like more, at least, something like a representative assembly of the nation, even though, as CS says, um, they just want to be something, but this is clearly not enough because if we were doing things according to what, as he says, social science would tell us to do things, if we were doing the things the right way, then we'd actually have a national assembly. We wouldn't give a monopoly to groups of people who are not thinking for everybody, they're thinking for themselves, right? Instead of that, we would actually have a national assembly that represented everybody and was and which would be represented by people who are not thinking about their own special privileges and places in society, but who would be thinking about the general interest, the general will, right? The collective will of the nation. Um, and once he gets to talking about, well, how should we be doing things, which he obviously thinks we should be doing things by having, in fact, a national assembly, he takes head on the idea that, well, what's said against this? Why are we not allowed to do this according to um, the nobility and the church? Um, the argument, he says, is, and this is essentially in chapter 5, what ought to have been done, basic principles, right? Where this is why he says, look, what we're even asking for is pretty pathetic because this is not the way it should be. What it should be is we should actually have a national assembly, right? There, he says, the argument is, well, that would go against the law, right? It's the law of the French kingdom that people are constituted according to these orders, that they fit into these three different parts in society, and that's the law. You're trying to go against the law, right? And this is a very interesting part because like Rousseau, and this is again coming straight out of Rousseau, Sieyès' answer is uh, only the nation can be the source of the law. Any other law is irrelevant. On page 172, this is a sentence essentially in the middle of the page. He talks about where constitutions come from and whether a nation can be subject to a constitution, meaning in the sense that you could create a constitution and say, this defines what the nation is, right? And his argument is that just goes completely against the very idea of a nation. Any nation, any collective will forms itself. If it gives itself a constitution, then it has a right to change that constitution. That's part of what it means that the nation is sovereign and that it rules itself. Yes, it is a source of all laws, so also of constitutions, and that is how its sovereignty is actually enacted through those kinds of laws. But because it is sovereign, it can always change its will. It can always change its constitution, right? So this is why he says not only is the nation not subject to a constitution, again, this is a sentence in the middle of the page, but it cannot be and it must not be, which is tantamount to saying that it is not. And one paragraph down, he says, can it be said that a nation, by a primary act of will, which is completely untrammeled by any procedure, can bind itself to express its will thereafter only in certain determined ways? And he says, in the first place, a nation can neither alienate nor waive its right to will. And whatever its decisions, it cannot lose the right to alter them as soon as its interest requires. Secondly, with whom would this nation have entered into such a contract? I see how it can bind its members, its mandatories, and all those who belong to it. But can it in any sense impose on itself duties towards itself? What is a contract with oneself? Since both parties are the same will, they are obviously always able to free themselves from the purported engagement, right? Since it's like you as an individual. If you make a contract with yourself, you can always change it. There's nobody who could come and say, oh, you've somehow gone against my rights. No, you've made it with yourself. And for Rousseau and for Sieyès, to say that the nation is sovereign is to say that it can never actually combine itself at any moment to something having to do with its future interests. Um, since I've been trying to track Kant throughout this discussion, it's very interesting that Kant has a very comparable scenario to this scenario of the nation not being able to bind itself and its will. But notice, as I'll describe it to you, that he does it precisely through the concept of learning. If you go back to What is Enlightenment, there's a section in What is Enlightenment where he says, you know, could a group of clergy get together and say that dogmatically this is what all generations hereforth have to believe about religion, right? We've decided this, it's our will, right? And this is what it is. And he says this goes against human nature, right? And his explanation is human nature is about learning. So nobody can contract itself in such a way that would prevent future generations from learning. In Rousseau's case, you see here, and Sieyès' case, it's all about the collective will. The collective will cannot bind its own future because it is the source, that will is always free. And it is the source of all laws, meaning that it can change that will whenever it suits its interest to do so. If you go to page 4, 5 in the social contract, and I'm not going to read all of this from the social contract, but if you go to page 4, 5, basically Rousseau says almost the same thing. Starting out from the bottom of page 4, that paragraph, uh, he basically says, um, it is against the nature of the body politic for the sovereign to impose on itself a law which it cannot infringe, right? Um, and he says, being able to regard itself in only one capacity, it is in the position of an individual who makes a contract with himself. And this makes it clear that there neither is nor can be any kind of fundamental law binding on the body of the people, not even the social contract itself, right? So the whole point of the social contract is to create a national will, a collective will that then is essentially a free one that can constantly think for itself. So this is why CS says, look, the idea that somehow there is a law of the kingdom of France that decides what the national will of the French people is. This is BS, right? Um, this again goes against the very idea of our humanity and what our freedom as human beings, which again is our capacity to come together and recognize each other in a society of rights And that would take all of that essentially away, right? So uh, here you have basically Sieyes's, this is in the intervening period before the Estates General meet. And he said it all out already, right? He said, okay, look, we're looking for these demands which are frankly not enough. And what should really happen is that we should have a national assembly, which is fundamentally based on our human rights that we all have all together, and that should determine our citizenship, right? And the way the French Revolution works out, the way that it works out is essentially according to this script that Sieyès, at the beginning of it at least, that Sieyès sets out. Because in May 1789, the Estates General meets, and the aristocracy insist on the different orders, the different estates meeting essentially on their own, not all together, and voting by order. And the third estate essentially refuses this. Uh, And on June 13th, a few members actually of the order of the church come and sit together with the third estate, which after that comes to describe itself as the national representatives of the French people, right? And on June 17th, it essentially says, look, we are not the third estate. We are actually, as CS says, we are the representatives of the people of the nation. We stand for everybody because we are actually thinking for everybody, unlike the church and the nobility. So the nobility puts pressure on the king, and the king closes the chambers of the third estate and doesn't even let them meet anymore. And this is where they go in Versailles and they find the tennis court. And on June 20th, they swear the oath of the tennis court, basically saying, "Look, we are the representatives of the French nation. Wherever we are, that is where the French nation actually is." And we're not going to stop until we've actually created a constitution for the French nation. And this is essentially the starting point of what you could say is the French Revolution. The king, Louis XVI, is a bit flummoxed. He doesn't quite know what to do. And for the time being, he kind of stalls, and he calls the army to Versailles, a contingent of the army to come to Versailles. And as he's doing this, essentially, it seems like state order is breaking down almost everywhere. It's been a very, very bad year in terms of the harvest. People are very, very afraid of gangs of people roaming around. There are riots in the streets in Paris already, in a context where it seems like state authority has somehow broken down, and people are very afraid of what is the king actually going to do. Why has he called a contingent of the army to Versailles? So people try to essentially go and arm themselves, and this is how the fall of the Bastille happens, right? And this is the moment in July 14, the people trying to go and find arms, essentially, thinking that the Bastille has a lot of arms in it, essentially take over put the Bastille under siege, eventually manage to take it over. And this is the moment in which the king, again, he doesn't quite know what to do. He's afraid of actually using force and then having the soldiers not follow his orders. So, this is the moment where he actually acquiesces. He says, all right, I'm going to let this process basically continue. And actual order transfers to a kind of people's militia that is formed by the Marquis de Lafayette. And you guys know this is the flag of France, obviously. But you may know the two colors, right? You see the blue and the red. These are the colors of the city of Paris, and the white is actually the color of the Bourbon dynasty. So this is where the tricolor actually comes from. It's from this moment of the people's militia in Paris, and the tricolor. This is becomes the emblem of the national flag, of the flag of the people. This is why there are three colors for as the flags of so many countries around the world. Essentially, they're taking it from this moment of the French Revolution, of the flag now not standing as the shield, right, as representing the family and the dynasty of whatever member and hierarchy of the nobility is ruling some territory, but as representing actually the will of the people. All right. So, uh, as this happens, uh, the revolutionary process actually essentially can continue, um, because essentially the people who had called themselves the National Assembly can convene and decide essentially to move forward with eventually putting together a constitution. Uh, Something essentially like a democratic constitution for the French nation, right? And this is on August 26, 1789. They declare the rights of man and the citizen, right? Before they even do that, on August 4th, this is the moment when they actually abolish the previous system, which now they call very self-consciously the old regime, right? Think about, since this is a class, we're talking about the rise of when does the new and innovation come to be seen as something positive and good, right? This is precisely, you see this, what is problematic, what is no longer sustainable, what is wrong-headed and needs to be improved upon. This is the old regime, the ancien regime, right? The old regime. Now we are going to turn a new page essentially in human history, and we're going to create a society and a state that are based on our fundamental humanity and human nature rather than on supposed privileges coming from God, right? So before you even have the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, on August 4th, feudalism is abolished. The old regime essentially is abolished, which means um, all of those dues, for example, that members of the peasantry actually had to pay to the nobility or to whoever owned the largest property in their manor, um, all of those are taken off. Uh, there is an indemnity that at the time the peasantry are said to owe to the nobility. Eventually, that indemnity also goes away as the revolution becomes more radicalized, which we'll talk about briefly at the beginning of the next lecture. But more than anything, this is a moment in which it's felt, emotionally felt for the first time, the idea that fundamentally we are all equal. We're all human beings. We're all brothers. In fact, some members of the other orders, the ones who are willing to go along with this way of thinking about things, come and sit together with the National Assembly. And it's a very emotional night. People cry, people hug each other, right? All of those barriers between us as human beings have fallen away. Now we're all fundamentally the same human beings, which we have always been, but now we understand that citizenship comes actually ultimately from our humanity. And then this is defined on August 26, 1789, right? And I'm going to go through this document with you um, quickly, but you'll see so much of it is key for what actually happens in the aftermath. So, number one, we already talked about men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. Two, The aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression, right? We have politics because the point of politics is actually to serve the rights that we all have in common. Politics is not a privilege of a group of people who are chosen to do something supposedly by some authority, whether it be cosmic, religious, or otherwise. The point of politics is actually to serve our common human rights, which we all have, and they are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Three, the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation, right? So, what is it that actually allows for those common rights to exist? It's the sovereignty of the nation. That is why our fundamental right to rule ourselves comes in the form of national sovereignty and is fundamentally based on our humanity and our human freedom. Okay, these are the key articles, obviously, of the Declaration. 4. Liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits except those which assure to the other members of the society the enjoyment of the same rights. These limits can only be determined by law, right? Uh, this is a basic plank, right, of liberalism that you always see. As long as I am practicing my freedom and in nowhere infringing on your rights, then you should not infringe on my freedom to do something which is doing no injury to somebody else, and that those injuries will be determined by law, by precisely the sovereign will of the nation. 5. Law can only prohibit such actions as are hurtful to society. Nothing may be prevented which is not forbidden by law, and no one may be forced to do anything not provided for by law. Again, law as the basis of our common rights as defined by our collective will, the nation. 6. Law is the expression of the general will. Here you have it clear coming out of Rousseau. Every citizen has a right to participate personally or through his representative in its foundation. It must be the same for all, whether it protects or punishes. All citizens, being equal in the eyes of the law, are equally eligible to all dignities and to all public positions and occupations, according to their abilities and without distinction except that of their virtues and talents. Here you have what was said in Article 1 that distinctions can only be based on the general good. That's essentially spelled out in 6, right? Um, that anything that has precisely to do with the honor, essentially, and the dignity to be able to uh, represent and implement the rights of everybody else in the society can only be based on people's merits. That there's some good reason that somebody deserves essentially to be in that position, not because they were born as so and so such and such or had such and such blood belonging to this or that family, right? Okay, 7 through 9 talk about the ways in which we are all persons before the law and how the law applies essentially equally to everybody. So 7 says, no person shall be accused, arrested, or imprisoned except in the cases and according to the forms prescribed by law. Anyone soliciting, transmitting, executing, or causing to be executed any arbitrary order shall be punished, but any citizen summoned, arrested in virtue of the law shall submit without delay, as resistance constitutes an offense, right? So there can be nobody who does anything except by the law. But once the law is decreed and once the nation says that this is its will, everybody has to obey. There are no exceptions. 8. The law shall provide for such punishments only as are strictly and obviously necessary, and no one shall suffer punishment except it be legally inflicted in virtue of a law passed and promulgated before the commission of the offense. Right? Um, this is self explanatory. So is 9, as all persons are held innocent until they shall have been declared guilty. If arrest shall be deemed indispensable, all harshness not essential to the securing of the prisoner's person shall be severely repressed by law. Uh, these were crucial uh, articulations of the idea of the rights of man and of the citizen, because so much of the old regime and how things were done in the old regime depended on having, again, special rights and privileges. The king had the right, for example, to arrest anybody he wanted at any moment. Those people placed in the Bastille were precisely people, they were special groups of prisoners, not like the common prisoners. Here again, you see, if somebody is going to be arrested, it has to be through a law, and it has to be the same for everybody, no exceptions. 10. No one shall be disquieted on account of his opinions, including his religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law. 11. The free communication of ideas and opinions is one of the most precious of the rights of man. Every citizen may accordingly speak, write, and print with freedom, but shall be responsible for such abuses of this freedom as shall be defined by law. Right? Um, Freedom of speech, freedom of communication, but notice that ultimately, actually, the law and our sovereign will decide the extent of this freedom and when it might actually be deemed abusive or not. In some ways, historically, number 12 may be the most important article in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Um, when people say that the French Revolution transformed the nature of human history and did so to the extent that we still are in the midst of it and don't know where we're headed completely, it's number 12, probably more than anything, that accounts for that. It says the security of the rights of man and of the citizen requires public military forces. These forces are therefore established for the good of all and not for the personal advantage of those to whom they shall be entrusted. What this basically means is, since this is your country, this is your nation, you, because it is the source of your freedom, you must be willing to die for your country, right? And what does the French Revolution do? It essentially gives arms to the people. This is for the first time that the masses of the people, in all the history that we were looking at, predominantly the monopoly on arms is what actually allows a group of people to have control over the rest of society. Now, the whole point at that, the whole um, conception of saying that there is a warrior class was to say that other people were not supposed to actually bear arms. Now you can actually ask everybody, all citizens essentially, to fight for their country. This is why the nation state becomes such a powerful instrument in the history of human society, right? Machiavelli wasn't thinking about this. He was talking about, well, the prince should have his own forces. He should have forces that are loyal to him. But the idea that the populace bears arms, and so that's actually why the control is ultimately in its hands. This is a completely radical departure, and so much of the history that we're going to study after this, right, has to do with this fact. It has to do with, if you ask people to identify and to die for their country, that is going to radically change the nature of human society, and it has since the French Revolution. And eventually, everybody moved towards this model of government because it is incredibly powerful to be able to throw all of the resources of a society and ask that society to act as one in its self protection, or obviously in fighting, presumably against other nations, which we're going to talk about. For most of the 19th century, the only experience that people had had of national wars, of a people coming all together to fight for itself, had been the example of the French nation state. It's in the 20th century that we get the example of whole peoples coming basically to fight against each other in the world wars of the 20th century. But what makes the French Revolution survive, and not only survive, but the French nation state become the most powerful state for a whole generation, almost taking over all of Europe, has to do with number 12. 13. A common contribution is essential for the maintenance of the public forces and for the costs of administration. This should be equitably distributed among all the citizens in proportion to their means. 14. All citizens have a right to decide either personally or by their representatives as to the necessity of the public contribution, to grant this freely, to know what uses it is put, to know to what uses it is put, and to fix the proportion, the mode of assessment and of collection, and the duration of the taxes. 15. Society has the right to require of every public agent an account of his administration. The country belongs to us, so we are responsible for funding it, but then those who rule us are accountable to us. 16. A society in which the observance of the law is not assured, nor the separation of powers defined, has no constitution at all. This is self evident. And it was pitched in some ways against the British because, as you know, the British don't have a written constitution. 17. Since property is an inviolable and sacred right, no one shall be deprived thereof, except where public necessity legally determined shall clearly demand it, and then only on condition that the owner shall have been previously and equitably indemnified. Right? This is the right to property and to free property. Again, the ways in which this dovetails with Adam Smith's conception of the market as the instrument of actually defining what is good and what is value for society at large. That we do that through our exchanges with each other and through who most efficiently actually meets the demands of people in the society. As we talk about Marx eventually in the next couple of videos, for Marx, put all of the other articles to the side. It's number 17. That's really what the French Revolution fundamentally is actually about. For him, the French Revolution is the transition from a feudal society to a bourgeois society, to a capitalist society. So, all of this nice stuff about individuality, freedom, right? These formal rights that everybody has, at the end of it, for Marx, this is the right. And what right is it talking about? It's actually writing about the right of people who have property. Something we'll come back to. All right. So, uh, the French National Assembly becomes a constituent assembly that sits down and tries to decide, okay, uh, the old regime is gone. How do we actually create a new French nation state? And for 2 years, it works actually on a constitution. And some of the shifts that happen in these 2 years are particularly remarkable in the way that they've transformed not only France, created the idea of France as a French nation state rather than a kingdom that belonged somehow to the King of France. The king doesn't go away. He's actually part of the constitution, the first constitution. The king is made actually the executive of the French nation. Remember how Rousseau talked about you can have essentially a republican government, but you can have a monarch that acts as the executive, that executes the laws, essentially implements them. And that's the role that's given to Louis XVI. He's even given the chance to suspend legislation for at least a period of time. He goes along because he doesn't have much of a choice at the moment, although he's very much against. He clearly, for such a long time, the kings, the monarchs, the absolutist monarchs like Louis the XIV had worked against the aristocracy and counted on the third estate, counted on the bourgeoisie, basically to create this idea of a state that stands above society. And then the monarchs end up being, in a way, the victims of what they themselves have created. Because what are they? What right do they have to represent the state ultimately, other than being at the pinnacle of the of the aristocracy? And this, in a way, dawns on Louis the XVI as the revolution happens, and he could have associated himself with the French nation. In fact, from now on, he's no longer the king of France; he's the king of the French, right? Think about that difference, right? But he doesn't go along. And this is part of the radicalization of the French Revolution that we'll talk about. But what are some of the things that the Constituent Assembly, for example, does to show what is this new order? What is this going to look like actually, right? Here you see just a representation of libertas, of Lady Liberty. You see, these are the rights of man and the coming constitution in her hands. And that cap, that's the Phrygian cap, that was the cap that was worn by freed slaves in the Roman Empire. That's why it stands for liberty. And you have the symbol of the Masonic symbol in the background, because the Masons were the ones who articulated this idea of we're fundamentally all human and equal. And that had to be obviously done in secrecy in the context of the old regime, but now comes to into the open, essentially, in the context of the French Revolution. What the Constituent Assembly does is it gets rid of all of those different provinces in the Kingdom of France. Remember, each of whom previously had been um, aristocratic titles of one kind or another. That's why the King of France had so many different titles depending on the kind of claim within the feudal hierarchy that he laid on this or that territory. And that meant each territory within the Kingdom of France had different ways in which it was constituted, it had different rights, it had different privileges. All of that has gone away. Instead, now you have departments. All of them basically equalize on the basis of population, 83 of them, you see in 1791. The guillotine, right? Remember, I said the aristocracy had different privileges even as to how they would be executed. The guillotine was precisely an emblem, a symbol of equality. It was symbol of an order based actually on, it was thought, science, right? Uh, Look at this. It's a mechanical instrument. And the idea was that we're going to actually reduce suffering as much as possible and create a punishment that applies equally to everybody and is as advanced as humanly possible. And doesn't, the execution of the law is not about torture and causing suffering, but it is the will of the people. It is the law. In actual fact, the guillotines often did not work very well. The blade would get dull after killing a few people, and so um, it was actually a rather horrible way to die for many people. But the ideal of it was the opposite of what it was like. We're gonna come to this, the women marching on Versailles, but a few other things that the revolutionaries do. The Constituent Assembly, um, they emancipate the Jews, right? Remember, religion had been the basis of politics until now. So if you had a different religion, you had different rights. Uh, you were not you were not in the same hierarchy in the same way as everybody else, because you didn't even agree to the basic blueprint of how that society was supposed to be hierarchically constituted. So in a way, The Jews were the outsiders of all societies that defined themselves in one way or another as Christian. And historically, they had been the only religious minorities predominantly after the Spanish kingdom, for example, what becomes the Spanish kingdom gets rid of Jews and Muslims. Uh, the Jews are the only minorities, essentially, religious minorities all around Europe. Uh, in the French Revolution, they become citizens. The idea is religion, with the freedom of opinion and expression, becomes simply a private matter. Now, Jews are citizens like anybody else. They are human beings like everybody else. They have the same rights and obligations, and what they believe or don't believe is essentially their private concern, as long as they fulfill the rights and obligations of citizenship. Um, this then becomes a blueprint for what happens in the emancipation of Jews with the spread of the nation state all around Europe over the course of the 19th century, right? Um, we'll talk about, especially since in a few weeks we're going to be reading about the Holocaust, the story of what happens to this fundamental minority in the European context, Jews, tells us a lot about what is actually happening in the society, right? In this moment, you see Jews are integrated into the society like everybody else as citizens on the basis of common rights, rather than on a religious basis being the outsiders of society. Another thing, something that at least everywhere in the world, except in the Anglo-Saxon context, all of us have, the metric system, right? Comes out of the French Revolution. Again, these former measures like the pound and the foot, these were, the foot, the size of the foot of some king, and that became the measure essentially for everybody else in the society. Now the idea is no, we should base this on natural principles, and it should be rational, it should be logical, which is what the metric system tries to be, based on essentially a logarithmic proportions, right? Starting on the orders of 10. So uh, creating a new society based on our humanity, on natural scientific measures, right? And ultimately, then the nature of the government itself. Remember, now the nation is supposed to choose its representatives that are then supposed to help in forming its will, its collective will. This is where things get interesting because um, even though this is a story about universal human rights, right? The rights of man and citizenship as being based on these rights that we all have in common, when it comes to decide who can actually elect the representatives of the people, and who can be a representative of the people, the Constituent Assembly does not go as far as you might have imagined with all of this talk of humanity and universality and a collective will. Women are not given the right to vote. And men have actually a property requirement. They have to be able to pay a special direct tax, and if that tax applies to them, then they can actually elect, and a little more than half of males actually did have this privilege. And look at the language that I'm using already, right? And almost half could actually also be representatives, which, as we talk about the 19th century and we talk about Marx, even at this very early point, this is actually pretty generous because all of those liberal democracies that start to emerge in Europe usually have some kind of property qualification, for to allow people actually to vote, or to be representatives. And even in this case, only men are able to vote, and of those, about half, and only about. And the idea is it's an indirect democracy. people vote for a number of electors, one for each 100. 100 people can vote for one elector, and then that those electors come together in provincial assemblies, and then they vote for members of the National Assembly, right? So this immediately brings up the idea of, well, why? Why are women excluded? Why are people who don't have enough property? How can you justify this? How is this possible? When you're talking about all of these things about humanity and rights that belong to all of us and our equality, on what basis can you actually exclude women or exclude people who don't have enough property? And that's not even it. There, at this point, the French state, the French kingdom, has all kinds of territories in the Americas in which slavery is practiced. What about them? Are they not human beings? Right? Um, this is where Olympe de Gouges and what she writes on the rights of women in the French Revolution comes into our discussion, right? Women played actually a very large role in the French Revolution. They were not bystanders in the French Revolution. Uh, you see here the women march on Versailles October 4, 1789. You see all these women with spears and axes and pickets. They're the ones, a group of market women are the ones who actually go to Versailles, get the king from Versailles and bring him to Paris and say, you are now a king of the French nation. You don't have any right to go and hide yourself away from the people. You have to operate in front of the French people. And not only that, women are they are part of all of these political clubs, like the Jacobin Club that emerges, which engage in all of these debates. What Kant, remember, said, the public use of reason. And everything that happens in the Constituent Assembly and in all of the assemblies in the French Revolution usually are parlayed through these clubs, these political clubs, and what people are saying and how they're debating in these clubs. And women are a very, very large part, actually, of these clubs. So they are not bystanders in any way. However, they are not given the vote. And how is this justified? Well, on page 161, when Sieyès is talking about, well, why is it that we don't give servants or women uh, actually the right to vote? Well, because servants can't actually think for everybody, right? They're dependent on somebody else. That's why we can't, you have to have some property to be able actually to be able to think for everyone. Because if you don't, then you're a servant, you're a dependent, you can't actually be independent enough to think for everybody. And that's the idea also that's applied to women. Women are too dependent, right? They don't have their own personalities. They're part of the families that they come from. So they lack the maturity, they lack the consciousness actually to think for everybody. So since they can't think for everybody, since they're only bound to think for themselves and their own situation or their own family, then we can exclude them, right? So this, think about how, what an interesting way of using the idea of the capacity to think universally, and then saying, well, not everybody actually has that, so we actually have to not be universal and exclude some people. Very, very convenient. You'll see this logic emerge in many different contexts. You start talking in universal terms about everybody, humanity, this is for everybody, this is for our common rights. And then you say, oh, look, but these people can't think in fully human terms, right? They're not mature enough to think actually for everybody. So since we want people who are thinking for everybody, these people have to actually be taken out, right? And that's the context in which Olympe de Gouges actually writes the rights of women. Um, and on the one hand, it's a condemnation, it's a denunciation of men who presume to say this about women, right? Uh, So it said, how does CS justify not extending full citizenship to servants, dependents, and to women? I just explained that. What would the Goosh say? On the one hand, she denounces men. At the beginning of the rights of women, you see on page 262, man, are you capable of being just? Right? Who are you to decide essentially what women are and are not capable of? It's almost like the nobility telling the bourgeoisie what they are and are not capable of, right? In fact, women, and she look at in the opening paragraph, she makes recourse to nature, right? Since all of these rights are coming from nature, they're coming from our human nature. Well, look at nature, right? In so many areas of nature, women, meaning females here, have play as fundamental or usually a more fundamental part uh, than the male of the species. Only in humanity have males arrogated to themselves these rights and excluded essentially women from them, right? And so she says to women, addressing women, and she says, wake up, this is the moment. This is the moment where you have to act and you have to make sure that you're actually seen as equal. And this means not only having equality of rights, but having the same equality of obligations. As being able to also serve and never be an exception. Don't say, oh, I'm a woman, so I can't do this, or I shouldn't be subjected to that. No, you are a full human being. And so she's talking even more than to men, she's talking to women and pleading with them to say, look, if you don't actually rise up in this moment and claim your whole human equality and your rights, and then the obligations that come with being a full human being and a citizen, then in this moment, you're going to end up actually becoming more and more despised, much more despised, even though now supposedly you're a citizen, much more despised than you've ever been actually in history. And to try to explain that, she says something which is uh, pretty interesting and you might find very, very surprising on page 265. Uh, this is the paragraph before the last one. She says, women have done more harm than good. It's not what you're expecting to hear from somebody who is trying to vindicate the rights of women. But the way that she makes that argument, why is it that women have done more harm than good? Because women have been the this is why Siaz refers to women in the same line with servants and dependents, because women have been the models of dependence. They have been the model of how you try to actually get ahead in a dependent situation. And so she says, in a way, look, the monarchy, the old regime, and the way that it functioned in some ways was actually a kind of female, feminine world in the way that femininity has been defined up to our time, up to the French Revolution, as meaning dependence, right? Women, on the one hand, were always the dependents, but so was everybody else. But they tried to exercise power actually through their dependence, right? By trying to charm men by their beauty, by their vials. Um, and so, in a way, everybody was like a woman in the old regime. And yes, on the one hand, we were reviled, we were looked down upon as dependents. On the other hand, since everybody was dependent, women knew how to exercise power, how to get ahead as dependents by uh, trying to get on the good side of whoever was higher than them in the hierarchy, whichever men. They could charm men, essentially manipulate men, and so exercise power as dependents. And since this kind of exercising power as a dependent uh, was not only something females did, but that's what everybody in the society had to do in a monarchy, right? In a society based on dependence, everybody, that's, the whole system seemed to be a system run on a feminine model. This is why women have done more harm than good, because they have been the model of trying to exercise power through manipulation as servants and as dependents. And in a way, she's saying, look, if you want actually to be a full human being, and you want to be respected, you have to put that way of practicing power behind. Otherwise, people are always going to see you like that, and they're going to associate you with the old regime. They're going to say, look at these women. They can't ever do anything as independent human beings with rights. They can only get ahead by playing and manipulating other people. So if you want actually to be a full human being who has rights, you have to put that model of power behind you to come to form part of the collective will through your human equality, through assuming the same rights and obligations. And at the very end of the writing, you see that she goes from the rights of women in this sense to saying how slavery should essentially be abolished on the same basis. So, if some group of men or some group of men try to exclude some other group of men on the basis that they are servants, dependents, etc., uh, here you have essentially Olympe de Gouges, and then you'll see so many others fighting precisely to make sure that those rights are extended ultimately to everybody. Fighting in the name of the same rights that actually they are excluded from. All right. This is, I think, enough for this part. And I'm going to put this on now, and I'm going to move on now to talk about Marx. Um, and you'll see I'll pick up with the aftermath of the French Revolution as I do this, and I'll see if I can get to it tonight. And if I can't, I'll do it early tomorrow morning. And so you should have it at some point. But there will probably be also two videos for Marx. Um, but this is good for the French Revolution. So I'll stop here.